So, you want to hear a story, huh? One about treasure hunters. Have I got a story for you?
There are very few games that can say they defined or created an entire genre on their own. These are the games like Rogue, Dark Souls, Mario 64, and of course the original Borderlands. These are legendary titles that became synonymous with their genre and cornerstones of the gaming industry. So today, when someone says the phrase looter shooter, 9 out of 10 times, this is going to be the series you think of, with its unexpected success inspiring massive hits like Destiny and not so massive hits like Suicide Squad or the Borderlands movie. Seriously, what the fuck were they thinking with that? Now, as always with videos like this, full spoilers ahead for the original Borderlands if for some reason you clicked on this video and still haven't played it 15 years later. But what was it about this game that resonated with so many players? Since on the surface it just looks like a standard 2010 shooter with some cel shading thrown into the mix. Was it maybe the flawless game design, top tier graphics, or maybe it had gripping writing ahead of its time?
Engorge, the only product ever to be personally endorsed by notorious ladies man, Mr. Shank.
Yeah, so this shit is tits, guys. You should see what my bitch thinks of me now. Her name is Chad Nina, and she...
Okay, so maybe not that, but also maybe yes? I'll get more into it later, but the story of Borderlands 1 ranges from non-existent to incredibly simple. So if you go into this game expecting something on par with the Halos of the time, you're gonna be disappointed. But what the writing did have though is traces of that same Borderlands charm it would later become known for, just in a much more subdued, less in-your-face manner. Well, yes, a lot of the jokes have definitely not aged gracefully into the modern day. Even lines like that, at the time, really separated the vibe of Borderlands from the gritty, serious shooters with the likes of Gears of War or Call of Duty that dominated the space. This gave it a purpose to exist outside of just being another run-of-the-mill shooter. Plus, its characters were actually funny a lot of the time.
Man, my girl Lainey, she perfect, man, blonde, great body, distantly related to me, great body, but then fridge rats brainwashed her. You gotta snap her out of that cannibalism crap.
So with the writing being pretty much hit or miss, that leaves the gameplay. And by God, did it nail that for the time. When Borderlands was released back in 2009, the ability shooter craze hadn't really taken over yet, even less so with the console gaming player base of the Western world. And in looking to carve a niche for itself, this once Mad Max clone rebranded into an RPG class-based shooter. The devs forewent the standard character creation where you simply pick a class and match it to whatever you want, and instead intertwine the personality of each class with their own set playable character. These classes are designed to be as simple as possible to help draw in new players to the genre, while also hitting 4 very different playstyles to leave room for every kind of combat that people want to use. Going through those characters, first we have Brick, and yes, that is his real name, and it fits him pretty well. Basically, you just punch. When using Berserk, he simply drops his guns, gets real tanky, and starts throwing hands with the nearest psycho. This is for the players who just want to be in their enemy's face and frontlining, not so much for a slow and tactical playstyle. Dialing back the steroids just a little bit gives us Roland, who uses a turret. It's pretty much a standard soldier class for players coming from the Call of Duty type franchises, with an ability that's just use and forget, since the turret will work on its own, and pretty much all of the skill tree paths focus on all-around passive upgrades, such as increased weapon damage, heal faster, or turret changes. Next up is Mordecai, who follows that up as a standard sniper class, because obviously every game needs one. And while Roland was a mix between a slow and aggressive playstyle, Mordecai is built around using snipers and other long-range weapons for a critical hit-heavy game. Basically, if you aren't hitting headshots, you won't get very much out of this class, which does make it the highest skill floor, but he also does have Bloodwing, which on top of just being the best boy, gives players help if they can't hit their shots, but they still really want to play in the gimp suit. And then finally we have Lilith, who since this game has come out has pretty much become the main character of the franchise, and she's what we'll come to know as a Siren, which are basically just girl bosses with magical powers inside of the Borderlands universe. She's more of your all-around class, not stuck in one niche, bouncing between supportive, elemental, and assassin. Her ability, Phase Walk, turns her invisible and increases movement speed. Then when it's finished, will blow up nearby enemies. I've always enjoyed playing the elemental tree, and that's what you'll see mostly footage of here, but it's by no means her only build. With the characters out of the way, let's talk a little bit more generally about those skill trees. Much like the classes themselves, these are the watered-down versions of what you would see in other RPG games, once again helping with the transition into ability-based shooters for new players. You still have the option of bouncing between the different branches to really min-max, but having self-explanatory paths to follow with just one big upgrade at the end was a fantastic way to help bring in those new players without requiring them to consult the almighty fan wiki every time they want to have a decent build. Looking at you, Destiny. So this setup, working in tandem with the very simple classes to understand, really helped propel this game into the mainstream. Okay, so enough yapping about setup, background, characters, let's start going over the actual gameplay. And just as a preface, mostly everything in this very long section will be centered around my solo playthrough, but it's important to keep in mind that 4-player co-op was a big draw for Borderlands Gen 1's marketing and does fix some of the problems I have. After selecting your character, which should have been Lilith by the way, you get dropped off right outside the now iconic town of Firestone, where we meet everyone's favorite character, Claptrap. Okay, so I joke about that now since he's really become the punching bag of the series, but at the time people loved this little guy. The sort of annoying but in a lovable way robot who's programmed to only sound upbeat even when quaking in fear from gunfire was a pretty genius idea and a great hook for players experiencing the game for the first time. Plus on top of all that, it keeps the tedious but necessary tutorial section engaging. Miniature Jack Black will quickly introduce you to the two main things this game will have you doing: shooting and looting. Genre name makes sense now, right? And okay, I don't want to make too many comparisons to the later games since the goal of this video is to look back on Borderlands 1 and see how it became such a breakout hit for the time, but when you are going back and playing the original, it's very clear this was a rough draft of what would come later, with both the shooting and looting have some pretty clear issues. That's not to say it isn't fun though. Even in this first combat section, the gunplay feels good and the character movement is solid. Plus the instant feedback of bigger and bigger numbers on screen are a cheat code for injecting dopamine into our monkey brains. It's basically the basis of those shitty mobile game apps you see. Most of the issues come with the big combat set pieces later on and some of the bosses, so I'm gonna hold off on commenting too much about it till we get to those. I will, however, talk about the looting system, because good old Claptrap introduces us to our first chest. Get familiar because we will be seeing many. As this game proudly boasts, it has bazillions of different guns. Yes, an obvious marketing statement, but it's not as much of an exaggeration as you might think, or if you know the franchise, you already know what it's all about. It was the big allure to the game, letting us loot goblins, live out our dream of finding new things, and getting that one-of-a-kind item that our allies just can't. But unlike the later games, the drop table for these enemies are not unique. Instead, you can get almost any gun at almost any time, with the drop rates of better weapons being linked to a hidden strength value each NPC has. And I think the point of this was to avoid forcing players to grind the same bosses and encounters over and over again, since they weren't really sure if the new player base would commit to that, but in practice, it just ends up being frustrating when you cannot find a better gun, or you don't feel like you're getting meaningful upgrades as you take down the bigger bads. The gun variety comes from the fact that each weapon has a manufacturer that does better with different niches, and each part of a weapon can have a different manufacturer. These combinations create different, mostly unique weapons with different strengths. With only a few exceptions though, they didn't really give us a ton of special feeling guns in the base game. Most of the time the only changes you'll notice between weapons are damage types and some stat upgrades. But once again, you won't really start noticing that for a couple of hours. Right now you'll be getting introduced to the world's ethically questionable doctor, Zed, who is the in-universe reason why you can buy shields and other meds all around the planet, which is a really clever way to explain a game mechanic, which gives the game a vehicle to deliver more humor and world building when the machines have his personality. We end up seeing the same thing with the money-hungry arms dealer Marcus. Going to kill some skags for Zed and saving Claptrap after an ambush are the first set of quests you'll receive, and it's a pretty standard system. Talk with this person or interact with this thing to get a short wall of text to explain the mission. And those two quests are two of the three main kinds we'll see in the Borderlands series: a fetch quest, a go kill some random thing mission, or a long drawn out joke. This is probably the system that has been changed the least over the years, with the only real changes being how fast you'll level up, since it's pretty slow in this game. Doing that, Zed will eventually give us our first shield, meaning we are now just one upgrade away from having every part of our character ready. On the surface, it functions just like you would see in Halo, but the shield mechanic also leads into the loot goblin energy that Borderlands wants to go with, since you don't simply upgrade it with your levels or through stats. They spawn in through vending machines and chests just like any weapon. For all of its flaws, the loot system fully commits to its identity, and I absolutely love that every part of your kit is some sort of find. It makes that moment you get that one really cool item feel like hitting Cloud 9. And realistically, one of the big reasons this game might have blown up the way it did is it's basically a hidden gambling simulator a lot of the time, hitting you with constant dopamine overflow in basically the same way that Feastables took over the minds of children. Just kidding, Mr. Beast, please don't sue me. So after meeting up with TK Baja and getting some grenades, it's time to take down the first boss of the game. The characters have been yapping about some bandit leader named Nine Toes, and now it's our job to take care of him. That mission takes us to Skag Gully, our first new location outside of Firestone, but for the most part it doesn't feel distinct from Firestone at all, which is a common theme among new areas in Borderlands 1. A lot of it just looks and feels the same, which can be a little bit disheartening. Also around this time though, you'll be ticking to level 5, meaning your class ability is now fully unlocked. Giving you this class ability right before your big first boss fight is great timing, both giving the player a sense of confidence going into the fight and also as a way to build an expectation that it might be pretty difficult, since if you need this upgrade to complete it, what's the challenge like? That goes hand in hand with the planned gun stash you have to go through that will likely give you 2 guns better than both of the ones you already have. So how is the actual Nine Toes fight? Well, environmentally, it works really well. The location is the first we see of the Psychos, an enemy that would later become the mascot of the franchise, and the cave arena feels like an appropriate place for a bandit boss. As for the actual combat though, well, it's a challenging fight, unless you get lucky like I did on my playthrough and one of the dogs drops a really strong shotgun, which kind of just proves the point from earlier that where the full randomness of the drop cycles can lead to some really clutch moments and hype finds, but it comes at the cost of properly balanced fights if your player can suddenly end up with a near legendary right before the first boss. Then you also end up in a situation where you probably won't be changing your weapons out for a long time, since now it's unlikely you're going to find something better. Sadly, that design flies in the face of what Borderlands is really meant to be, and the opposite can also be true, where you're punished heavily by the game for not getting any legendaries late into the game, since by design you can't farm bosses. The chances of that happening are going to be a lot higher than pretty much any other game in this genre. But after beating 3 balls, you get to spend about an hour or so doing random side quests inside of Firestone and Firestone Part 2 to keep up with the enemy levels. You'll probably start to feel the fatigue of long runs between the mostly empty areas pretty quickly, and while the environments are nice, and because of its unique art style, the game has aged better than you would expect for a late 2000s shooter, it's still a bit boring when you need to run back and forth around the same area 4 times. Thankfully though, this is when you get to talk to Scooter for the first time and unlock the catch-a-ride system. But you know, before we get fully into that, I actually want to take a moment and talk about the fight for your life mechanic, since the quest to unlock it is the first time I actually really got to use it in the game. Basically, to help encourage players to fight more aggressively and not hide behind cover all of the time, Gearbox implemented a sort of second chance game design. Once your health hits 0, you can get a kill to heal back up and stay alive. This is one of the best choices the game devs made, since without it almost every class would have been forced to play an extremely slow playstyle, absolutely killing the pace of the game. It can be pretty annoying that you can't move around while in this mode, since oftentimes enemies can be just out of range for you to get that kill, but that is a small complaint in the grand scheme of things that I can ignore. But anyway, after killing Bonehead, you get your first vehicle, and since this game was originally designed to be a Mad Max car combat game, I am sure they nailed the vehicle controls, right? Well, let's just say there's a reason they pivoted away from that design. The car movement is just kind of fine, if not a little bit clunky. Not anything to write home about, but it's not going to make the game unplayable. The actual combat between cars is pretty bad though. If you have to kill anything inside of one, just try and run them over if at all possible. The turret feels clunky and inconsistent, and the explosives are much weaker than it feels like it should be, all while still being pretty tedious to use. But at this point while you're driving around, you might notice there still really isn't any story to the game, and that kind of changes but also kind of doesn't when the random voice in our head tells us to take down a certain bad guy. So you might think we're starting to get a little bit of story direction as you keep completing these seemingly random quests. And you kind of do, but again, it just feels like another random fetch quest, making it hard to tell the difference between the main quest and the side quest at this point. That does lead us to what I would consider the first really unique set piece of the game though, Sledge's safe house. Because so far, every area we've had to fight in was very open. Even the caves that Nine Toes lived in had plenty of room to run around. But the safe house is mostly made up of small hallways with plenty of cover, but also not a lot of ways to escape if an enemy like a badass psycho gets on top of you. And yes, I did spend 10 minutes trying to deal with this asshole. While we're trying to learn how this game's combat functions in such a small arena, we're subjected to multiple high-level badasses back to back for the first time. All of that creates a pretty steep difficulty curve compared to the relatively relaxed fights up till now. And that's not really a bad thing, though I do wish you weren't forced so hard into the side quest because of it, because if you want a fair shot at clearing these encounters faster than a snail's pace, you'll have to do pretty much every side quest offered to you, or suffer the consequences of being underleveled. Games of this genre tend to thrive when there are enough side options where you can only do the ones that look appealing instead of being forced into every single option available. Borderlands 1 does not have that. And those side quests are not short. You're gonna spend a couple of hours working your way through them so that you can get to the main story missions, which also still feel like more side quests since the plot hasn't gotten started yet once again. And while I did have some fun during those grinds, I think the main problem I have with it is just how silent everything is in these quests. It's hard to imagine if you've only played the later games, but Borderlands 1 was going for a more atmospheric, relaxed environment for the most part. For example, in one of the early quests I completed, I had to run around and pick up different parts, so it's a pretty standard fetch quest. And nowadays, you would expect a lot of input from whoever gave you the quest, or maybe the enemy that's trying to stop you, but here it's just silent walking and the sounds of combat. This does help keep the game immersive, so I can see why it was done, but on long grinding sessions when you simply just want to progress the story and need to level up, it can get a little bit boring. To better illustrate what I mean, take the quest The Hidden Journal, where we meet Tannis for the first time via audio logs. We're rewarded for finding these by getting a whole story about how she lost her mind on this awful planet while trying to research alien tech. It's one of the few early game quests that really build out the world and cast while also hinting at what we may see later on. And it's really great. I wish we saw more of this. That issue's at the forefront when it comes to actually accepting and turning in quests. A lot of the time there's zero conversation between you and the NPC, so it just feels very mechanical and lacks a lot of the charm that exists elsewhere in the game. But again, all of that isn't to say I don't enjoy the quest grind of this game. At times it was actually really fun and I found some pretty unique and entertaining jobs. The best quest I found while farming for the safe house, for example, was one that takes you to an arena where you have to fight multiple rounds of skags, with each quest tier getting harder and harder. This is basically the alpha version of a certain DLC we'll talk about later, and at least here it was a pretty cool idea. Once you are finally able to clear the safe house and complete the steroid-filled mini-boss, you unlock access to your second real boss of the game, Sledge. We also hear from Commandant Steel for the first time, who's basically the main antagonist of the game, even though I use that word very loosely because you rarely hear from her throughout the entire game and only actually see her twice. Neither time really giving much personality outside of, we want Vault and I am comically evil. Sledge lives in the Headstone Mines, which is an interestingly designed combat piece because while on the surface it looks like just any other outside area of the game, the miner-based type setup makes the navigation and search for loot pretty entertaining. Plus it has intelligent design that opens up a lot of different ways to deal with enemies and be smart about your pathing. Overall, it's not a hard area to clear, but it does have some level of challenge that makes the boss fight feel earned afterwards. My only real complaint is that the spawn points for deaths are really far apart, but that is a common theme throughout most of the game and can be solved by simply getting good. The actual boss fight is a bit of a mixed bag, being about on par with the Ninetales fight. His gun isn't really a threat, but the slam attack he does when you get too close causes the most issues. Plus he does have a full body shield that can eat a lot of extra damage added on top of the normal shield that all enemies have. The only time I really felt like I was gonna die in this fight though was not because it was challenging or because I misplayed, but instead my character would get stuck constantly inside the ground and be unable to dodge his slam. It wasn't too big of an issue since it never actually downed me, but I can see that being very frustrating if that was what got you killed, and it's a piece of design that probably should have gotten fixed before the release. Killing Sledge gives you the first part of the vault key, which is finally explained to us by the AI after we pick it up. Then Steel yaps about how it belongs to Atlas, and now you can start to put together what the rest of the game is going to be. A fetch quest for the vault key fragments, which can work as a setup, but they don't really do anything with it until you're in the vault itself, which is why people tend to say this game has a pretty lackluster story. Oh, and this either or door when you're going into the boss is a funny little piece of design. Didn't have a place to put that, but it got a laugh out of me and I wanted to mention it. At this point, we also unlock our first class mod, another key piece to Borderlands character building. I really enjoy how all these small upgrades from different areas eventually combine to make you feel like a real badass. Of all the RPG elements Borderlands tries to pull from, I think that's what it does the best. So now that we have the first part of the key, it's time to move from the small town of Firestone into the Doll Headlands, which looks pretty much the same, but bigger and more open, mostly consisting of large stretches of empty land meant to push this game's car mechanic to the forefront. So naturally the first set of missions here involve getting fast travel up and running so you don't have to use the cars as much as possible. This is a godsend at this point in the game, since I was really starting to get tired of all of the needed backtracking when running or driving between the quest areas or just going to turn stuff in. But now with car navigation as the name of the game for a bit, that means we get to experience the wonderful Borderlands vehicle combat in all of its glory. Before I said the driving mechanics weren't game ruining, and they still aren't, I want to make that clear, but specifically the car versus car fights are by far the worst part of this otherwise very fun game. This is something that's better in co-op, but still not amazing, and playing alone, it is just a miserable time. Because honestly, I was just considering using explosives to deal with the cars instead of fighting in one myself, it was that bad. But I couldn't really do that because we get a required mini-boss that's full-on car combat in a tiny arena. And the pattern of beating this fight is simply get in a car, kill as many ads as possible until your car inevitably breaks, die, get a new car, repeat until there's just Mad Mel, then come back with the new car and hope to God you can get enough damage on him before that one breaks. Plus, here we really see that the car physics in this game make zero sense, which can get incredibly frustrating in these longer set pieces. I straight up just ended up finishing Mel with a shotgun instead, since that felt easier than trying to use the cars for the fight, and this section is clearly an attempt to salvage what time they spent making a Mad Max combat type game, but in the end it just shows why that was abandoned. Borderlands is a fantastic game that would have been much better off had they just bit the bullet and fully removed the car combat. Thankfully, our suffering was rewarded handsomely, with us unlocking the real hub of the game, New Haven. This charming little trash town contains the most NPC interactions you're gonna get in the base game, which still isn't a lot, but you do get to some random people that you can talk to get a sense for the world. Pretty quickly though, we're asked to go to the Rust Commons and find Tanis, the scientist that was hinted at in the side quest I mentioned before. As an area, Rust Commons feels a lot like Headstone Mine, where we travel through different bandit camps of varying difficulty, and once again, it's not incredibly challenging as a subsection, but it was enjoyable to explore on my way to find Tanis. It's also the first appearance of the new enemy type with the spiders, which don't function that much differently from the skags, besides having a more accessible crit spot, but it's nice to have some more variety. We're consistently seeing new enemies added as we go through the game. Tanis lets us know a little bit more about the vaults, really getting into the plot finally, and tells us how we can keep getting more parts for the key by talking to Crazy Earl, which of course leads us to Earl's scrapyard, which is by far and away my favorite location yet. It's the first outside location that doesn't feel exactly the same as the rest of the game in terms of vibe and structures, with the giant trash piles, scrap towers you have to parkour around, and the dirty swamp-like water helping it stand out from the dry, dust-covered areas of of Pandora at large, even if the enemies are still just bandits and psychos. So after politely entering Earl's home, he sends us to Treacher's Landing, which I guess just proves that the best locations in Borderlands must run through Earl because this area is on par with the scrapyards in terms of design. That might just be because it feels the exact same as the scrapyard if it was just put on an island, but that doesn't matter because it still stands in contrast to almost the entire rest of the game. The actual level design throws a curveball too, with an insane amount of explosive and elemental barrels absolutely everywhere. It's a small change, but it created a lot more chaotic fighting space that would often down me for not paying attention, while also making some sections easier when you notice a well-placed barrel. Oh, and by the way, we're only here taking the lives of so many random people because Earl simply wanted some booze, which is great and perfectly fitting for the humor of Borderlands. So then once we get our best boy Earl his booze, turns out he's a dirty fucking liar who doesn't have the key anymore. So now our fetch quest continues as we go find Crom in the aptly named Crom's Canyon. Also, as a side note, while I do side quests before entering here, this is when I got my first legendary, which is roughly 7 hours into a 13-hour story, which isn't the worst timeline, but it goes to show how the shared drop tables can create a really long time before you get your first high tier gun. And the canyon itself has a very interesting design, with the area's walls rising high on both sides, you know, like a canyon does, making progression mostly one straight line. That's something we don't see often in this game, and even less so in the outdoor locations. Now that doesn't mean it's just one straight line you walk in, as the architecture runs up and down the side of the canyon, and the raised rock platforms create some variation in how you can move forward. It makes for a very unique fighting set piece that plays the elevation more than anywhere else in the game. And that design philosophy continues heavily into the actual Crom fight, making it the best designed boss fight of the game so far. Because instead of just being an enemy with a higher health bar, Crom is actually a pretty quick boss to kill once you get close to him, but getting close is the issue. He sits at top of his canyon with a turret that can almost instantly down you if you stay out of cover for too long, meaning you're gonna have to fight your way all the way uphill while parkouring to different mounds to get to him safely, then manage not to blow yourself up with his goon sitting behind him next to a bunch of barrels. It's honestly a fantastic way to add difficulty to a boss fight without unfair feeling mechanics or overly bullet sponge enemies, making this the model that I wish most bosses in this game were modeled after. Putting a bullet in the back of his head will give us our second vault key piece, getting us ever so close to that loot-filled dream of Pandora's vault. Then we get a little cameo from our AI friend, basically saying, hey, I'm watching, just not helping. So thanks for that, I guess. But really, at this point, I was pretty much checked out with trying to get invested into the story, since I'm almost 10 hours in and it still doesn't give you much of anything to work with besides some throwaway lines by Tannis and vague mentions about how cool the vault is. And that's true even after we go give her the next vault part, as she has zero spoken dialogue about this alien artifact. Oh, and quick random segue before we get into the next section, but can we start a petition to retroactively go back and remove racks from the game? Because honestly, they aren't hard to kill, dying in one shot to pretty much any gun in the game, but by God are they annoying. No matter what you're doing, they just randomly dive bomb you and pull you away from your current fight. It's like a little gnat just biting you and flying away before you can swat it when you're just trying to get shit done. All my homies hate the racks, petition down below. Alright, anyway, what does Tannis get us? Well, via a stolen arm, we get access to Janistown, a new section of Pandora that was considered too dangerous for us by New Haven's almighty leader. But since we are the main characters, we clear that out no problem. Suck it, leader, whose name I can't really remember right now. The new combat areas don't feel much different from places like Firestone or Rust Commons, but they are well designed in terms of combat flow, which is pretty much the standard for the game at this point. Sadly, we really don't get to spend much time here, since we need to go right back to Rust Commons for the next main quest. Again, it's a pretty standard find and kill X person mission, but during it, I started to notice the game relying very heavily on just throwing enemies up in hard to reach turrets and making combat arbitrarily slower now. That design was fun for a boss fight, and then maybe the first couple times afterward in normal combat, but it starts to feel like a lazy way to just slow down the player instead of making level designs that would naturally cause you to play safer like we saw before. But instead, now we just get more of the same old towns with 200% more turrets. Once we get through those though, we get to meet Punk Claptrap, aka the best one, and he unlocks Trash Coast. One thing you'll notice right away here is we see actual green grass for what I think is the first time in the game. That alone makes this area stand out pretty heavily, plus the AI woman is in our ear hyping this up as a massive challenge. So this is really set up to be a big set piece for the game as it gets ready to move into its final stages. And interestingly enough, the area leading up to that boss has very few enemies. Normally the game makes you fight through hectic hordes of bandits and other enemies to earn your boss fight, but here we just kind of saunter through the most relaxing location while a spider pops up here and there. Again, this makes it feel very different from the other main set pieces as we take in the greenery. Sadly though, the actual boss fight is the worst in the game and it's not even close. When people complain about this game's bosses just being large bullet sponges, this is exactly what they think of. The only real attack it has is shooting out racks every so often, and you know how I feel about that, but even if they do down you, they die in 1 or 2 shots, so you just get right back up. And the boss itself is so slow it pretty much never gets on top of you, forcing you to just slowly back away and spam it until it dies. And despite our AI girl all hyping it up, I think this game knows it is a super easy boss fight since the loot you get is very subpar. No extra chest to claim outside of the vault key piece. All around, I was really disappointed with this section that seemed so promising and unique at first, which sucks because this is the best looking area. Just having that little bit of green grass and vibrance helps a lot when you've been looking at nothing but dirt and metal for the entire playthrough. But hey, only one more vault piece to go, and Tannis tells us she knows where it is, so let's see if the next big fight can bring us back into the fold. That mission takes us to Old Haven, where we save Osimo. When first entering the town, it appears completely barren, with bodies of previous citizens scattered all around. You even get your side quests from dead or dying bodies of people who fought here. It honestly gives off a really eerie vibe that I love, and it's the closest this game gets to giving you a feeling of dread for what's happening in the world of Pandora because of these mega corporations. Eventually though, you'll run into people who wiped out the town, leading to our first combat with the Crimson Lance soldiers. Fighting these guys feels very distinct from the standard bandits because the AI actually feels smarter and they play behind cover more and stay in groups for the most part. And the different versions of the soldiers seem like they serve a purpose in combat for their side, with the engineers being solid mid-range enemies providing cover for infantry, while defenders are pumping out damage and stopping you from getting behind their newly placed cover. That, mixed with this being the first really lived-in town that seems to have a history we fought in, makes this set of missions stand out as the highlight for the game so far. Plus, it's just really nice to be fighting against a real threat to our goals, with the Lance wanting to open the vault first, even if they do still rely on some annoying turret placement here and there. But saving Claptrap will allow us to get to Salt Flats, which again is just a standard looking Pandora location, to take down Baron Flint. So starting with what I don't love about this, we have to do more car combat. But granted, it's not nearly as bad as before, because the Outriders come one at a time, but it could have been cut from the game without losing much, if anything, of value. Flint's compound on its own isn't too notable. It's a mid-tier level for difficulty and design for the game. That is until you get to the boss fight, and for its credit, it's a really solid encounter. Flint's arena is very close quarters with a lot of high-level enemies running you down, so if you slip up once, it can be instant death. Plus, it has phases of enemies that spawn in alongside other mini-bosses for you to get to Flint himself. All of this while he throws insults down from the top of his tower because you can't get to him, which already gives him more personality than all of Commandant Steel had throughout the entire game. His grenade shotgun is something you also really need to be careful around too, since unless you got really lucky shield finds, it's gonna be one or two shotting you in this fight. Overall, I really like this one. It's a lot better than the bullet sponge we had to deal with earlier. So once we send Flynn back to Michigan and get the key, we get what is one of two actual plot twists for this game, where Tannis only used us to get the key and gave it over to Steel. What the hell, Tannis? I thought we were homies. But now, since we can't let that shit slide, we gotta track down Tannis and get our vault key back. Unfortunately, we don't get the help of our AI friend, since Steel shut down all of the EchoNet communications. Woe is us, how will we survive? We find Tannis and Steel hiding in a set of caves and caverns called the Back Door. Insert obvious innuendo here. This is a really cool location, sort of giving a dungeon crawler vibe that nowhere else in the game has attempted, plus the mix of tight hallways and open rooms create a nice set of variety as you fight your way through. This location climaxes with a fight against the Crimson Royal Guard, a decently challenging, well-designed 3-on-1 fight in another arena-type setting. This game really does rely heavily on big circles to put bosses in, but the environments are generally different enough to not make it feel too samey. A couple more dead soldiers later, we find Tannis, who did sort of betray us, but also sort of didn't, I guess. Honestly, I don't really know, but I guess we're chill now because we are helping her get out of jail and get the Echo back up. The entire fight through the Lance headquarters is absolutely top tier Borderlands. It has constant, well-balanced action, and I was never feeling like I ran to an unfair location then just died for no reason. Plus, the maze-like design of the hallways mixed with long corridors and spacious caverns are perfect for the way combat flows inside of the game. For example, there's one section where you hit what looks like a dead end, only to see 4 badass engineers pop out at the same time. I was absolutely not ready for it, and created one of the most fun non-boss fight moments in my first playthrough. That grandiose endgame feeling doesn't stop when you leave the Crimson base either, because you will soon see that a third party has entered the chat: aliens. The Guardians of the Vault are against both you and the Lance, since they clearly don't think anyone deserves that scrumptious loot. Their design is awesome. These fast-moving, otherworldly beings that are just stringy enough to be both unsettling and hard to hit makes it feel like their design is straight out of something you would see in a modern analog horror series. I really can't sing the praises of this stretch of gameplay from the end of the Flynn fight to where we actually opened the vault enough. Even the long run between the towers when setting up the Echo feels fun to play because of the hectic battles between the flying aliens that are constantly swapping between you and the Lance. Plus, the different routes you can use to sneak around combat if both sides are already engaged with each other creates so much variety in how your individual game is going to play out. And it's so clear thematically that neither side wants you to easily get to the vault. I just love the game so much from this point on. Mostly, but we'll talk about that. Getting the Echo back up leaves us with just one goal: find Steel before she opens up that vault and
Take the bitch down.
That motivational line brings us to the Descent, our final location before the vault, and it is fantastic. The Guardians are front and center as the main threat, both from the sky and down on our level, as we have to slowly work our way down the mountain, mixing parkour in with the fast-paced combat. We see flowers and greenery overgrown all around, since this place has not been touched in hundreds of years, all while the walls are lined with what looks like writing or runes in whatever race these Guardians are. It's also mythical compared to the rest of Borderlands, which goes a long way toward giving it a sense of finality. This is also by far and away the hardest part of the game, but still not unfair. If you play smart and you're good at the game, it's possible to go through it without taking any deaths, so naturally I died several times. But the balance between the badasses, foot soldiers, and flying beam shooters was not easy to find, but I have to say that Gearbox Where's Waldo'd that shit perfectly. This all ends with a grueling final stand between you, the Lance, and the Guardians climbing through an uphill, snowy mountain. This is the first time all game we've seen anything other than a bright, sunny day, which really makes it stand out on its own. There's so much going on here that you won't see at all, with hordes of Guardians and Lance members fighting each other while you try and sneak past, only for you to then find yourself in the middle of another fight. It's never-ending, rewarding action, but then you finally reach the top. The music cuts out, and our AI motivational speaker gives us one last pep talk, and then it's time to head in. Bastille is already there and set up, giving her villain monologue as she opens the gates and we prepare to fight her for the glory and the loot. But then something else happens. The real plot twist of this game is that the vault is actually meant to hold in a monster known as the Destroyer, who promptly one-shot Steel, meaning the main villain was only on string for a grand total of 2 times and we never see her do anything, at least not in the main game. But the twist of the vault holding back this Lovecraftian monster is actually kind of perfect. We take that for granted now since we all knew it was coming, but throughout the game we are told how awesome this vault is and how it's a bunch of fantastic loot. We just have to unlock it. And that is the one thing about the story that's the most clear from the jump. And with this game's goal really just being get as many cool guns as possible, we have no reason not to believe that's the case. So yeah, for all the flame I gave this game's story, this was a good twist. With all that being said, this is the final boss, so how is it gameplay wise? Alright, I don't think it's a controversial take to say the final boss really sucks. Honestly, if I thought the mammoth looking thing from before was a bad bullet sponge, this is the most absorbent motherfucker I've ever met. The Destroyer is a boss that doesn't move, has one real attack pattern, and eats more ammo than you can carry. No, seriously, on my fight with him, I fully ran out of ammo on my guns before I could kill him. Luckily, I had picked up one of the infinite ammo weapons and had it in my backpack so I could kill him with that to finish the fight, but that was almost really bad. And its attack patterns aren't even that cool either. It just spawns in these rack reskins that do some poke damage, then shoots out its purple hentai tentacles for some easier crit spots, then sends a purple beam from one eye and repeats. This shit kinda sucks, man. But even with the lackluster ending, the final section of the game I think really showcases what Borderlands had the potential to become in later entries and the DLCs, and we are still rewarded with a ton of chests for having defeated this big bad. Which, if you haven't played the games before, might have you thinking, well, why does getting loot matter if the game's now over? Well, besides the DLC, being the story of Borderlands is really only the beginning of its gameplay loop, because we have now unlocked the appropriately named Playthrough 2, where you do the exact same thing, but with higher levels, harder enemies, and better guns. I'm gonna hold off talking about that fully for now though, and go through each of the DLCs in order of their release, starting with the zombie island of Dr. Ned, who is totally not Dr. Zed, so don't think that. This is the DLC that I actually remember the least about, and the one I'm pretty much the most excited for simply because it's zombie themed, and I simp out for anything like that. I really like that we get a full cutscene that set the mood for the DLC and the new area. It comes in the form of the bus driver at the beginning of the game, telling a story to what I assume is his kid. It is campy as hell, but it got one of the bigger laughs out of me from my playthrough so far.
So some bad crap was happening, and it got really spooky. And this is where our story begins.
Is any of this going to be true?
Yes, probably a lot of it. You're adopted.
And the beginning environments are really nice too. Jacob's Cove feels nothing like anywhere in the main game, in all of the best ways, which is exactly what a DLC should be. Once you start exploring the island, you'll find zombies and defilers. This DLC's new cannon fodder. Mowing down the zombies is super chill, and you can just kind of kite them like in any horde game, though the defilers are a little bit more annoying, specifically because they block your vision when throwing projectiles and slow and ground you. But something with range was 100% needed to add some sort of challenge to the battles. Except for the rack reskins they use, we did not need those, Gearbox. You should be ashamed ashamed of yourself. But after we clear out the main town with some sick-ass turrets, we need to go find Ned, who once again is not Zed. He's hiding out in an old treehouse where we have to wait through one of the slowest elevator lifts known to man. But that is the point where I noticed that DLC 1 has already started to address one of the bigger issues I had with the base game, the lack of consistent NPC interaction. So far, Claptrap was just yapping about the situation as we walked, and Dr. Ned was in my ear the entire time I was waiting for him to crank one out. Plus, now when you accept and hand in quests, you get actual dialogue, not just text on screen. That dialogue tells us he's using Skag DNA to work on a cure, and since that sounds legit enough, we take the hidden grave entrance he told us about to arrive at a hospital, which is also where we meet another mini-boss type called the Loot Goon, a bullet sponge with a chest on its back. There's nothing really special about it. Said hospital is guarded by our first boss of the area, a wereskag with a cool hat. Outside of his design, the fight isn't much different from anything you're gonna see in the main game, and was solved with just kiting and mag dumping. Thankfully though, the hospital grounds are very atmospheric, which makes up for some of the same old boss loop gameplay. Taking this medicine we found to Ned's Claptrap teaches us one of two things. One, this model has schizophrenia, and two, it confirms that the character dialogue will be a noticeable step up from the main game. Personality number 2 tells us that Ned is actually a bad guy, and that a boat will take us to his lab where we can go and confirm, which leads us to Deadhaven, which is just a reskin Old Haven from the campaign. I'm not the biggest fan of this since it's just another location that doesn't feel wholly unique, but I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt if it can be distinct from Old Haven in terms of feeling. And to its credit, the lab area is interesting and the different enemies like Tankensteins help it stand out, but a lot of your time here will just be spent standing still listening to audio logs, which yes, I know I asked for more of them, but not in the way where you just stand in an empty room and listen, more so during combat. So after we expose Ned to the Jacobs Corporation, we enter into a contract, meaning we have to head back to Jacobstown via an airlift sent by the corporation. It comes in the form of a pseudo lockdown survival step while you wait for the paperwork to get sorted out. You know, typical business stuff. And that mission section really highlights what this DLC does best, letting you chill and mow down easy ads and just kind of have a relaxing time while you take in the story. It's not hard, but nor is it meant to be. Once you get into the groove, the vibe feels akin to something people on my channel know a lot about, Warzone or General COD Zombies. And no, it's not just because it's undead themed. Back at the town, our unmedicated Claptrap friend gets straight up executed in front of us, and since we don't want to end up the same way, we agree to go murder the presumably evil Dr. Ned, but we don't really have full confirmation yet. But now I'm going to talk about what's probably my biggest gripe with this DLC, and we will see it in future ones as well, and that's the insane amount of backtracking and running between locations. There's not enough spaces for cars in this area, so we just don't get any, and all of the main locations are placed incredibly far away from each other. That combines to create a significant amount of downtime just spent trying to get to the next location. It's basically the same problem that Firestone was starting to have before we got the catcher ride running. But as we ignore that and march our way to Ned, he goes full mask off and just straight up shit talking us the entire time, which now makes two antagonists that are more fleshed out in less time. All of the fights to reach Ned are pretty entertaining as well. We get a nice mix of zombie types, plus we get some wereskags to mix things up. You always have plenty of room to move around in, and outside of badasses, you're pretty much gonna one-shot anything that comes near you. Plus the lumberyard that Ned hides out in is probably my favorite location looks-wise so far, and that includes the base game. When you do finally reach him, the Ned fight feels at first like it's going to be massively disappointing, where you can quite literally just slowly walk up to him and spam a pistol while he misses every shot. But then we get a fake out credit scene and undead Ned comes back to fight, which I'm honestly shocked I didn't see coming with how this DLC was set up. So that's on me. The new arena for undead Ned is fantastic. We go deep underground into a massive cave made up of flesh and blood pools, which is the closest Borderlands 1 has gotten to the crazy out-of-world set pieces we see in later games. And really shows that with the upgraded budget for these DLCs they got because of the main game's success, Gearbox knew what they wanted to do and they did it well. I would also say this is a better boss than anything in the main game. Mechanically, it's nothing game changing, pretty much just cycling between going underwater, surprise attack, summon minions, and do some bullshit Beyblade spin that shreds your HP. But it stayed engaging and was actually challenging to finish outside of just being a bullet sponge. And then on top of that, the environments and character 100% elevate this fight into that #1 spot. That is funny and the cave is gross but awesome at the same time. Then everything in the DLC has a constant vibe that feels like it accumulates in this boss. But yeah, that pretty much covers Ned's Island. A pretty short adventure, but it made up for it through pure charm and solid gameplay additions. Like I mentioned earlier, the only real complaint I have is the high amounts of backtracking and travel time, plus the grounding and slowing you get for some of the enemies. Overall, it was definitely worth its price as extra content, and the game is better off for having it. Unfortunately, I don't think I can say that about the next DLC, Mad Moxie's Underdome Riot, an addition that has a pretty poor reputation in the wider Borderlands community. The tone is set right out of the gate with the intro cutscene, and that tone is horny, which is to be expected with the introduction of Moxie, aka fan service the character. At least for now. The plot of the Underdome is, well, not really a thing. You're just here to fight waves of enemies until you win. But before we get to that, the biggest change the DLC brought is the bank system, something that will be around for the rest of the series, and it basically gives you more storage and allows you to transfer gear between characters, which is a fantastic quality of life change that I'm shocked took this long to get made. But wrapping back to the actual gameplay, the format of the dome battles are 5 rounds of 5 different waves, which cycle between a variety, guns, psychos, brute type enemies, and then a boss. Unfortunately though, the boss isn't unique, it's just a redo of one you fought in the base game, which is actually pretty lame for a new DLC. They even reuse the same voice lines. There is one fun mechanic that you get once you beat round 1, which is basically that between each wave, Moxie will give a buff to the enemies that makes it get progressively harder, and they stack based on how far you are, and your player count. This is simple things like buffing their damage or making you use one specific weapon, though they really needed some more dialogue options for each selection, or more selections, because if I had to hear, "Get your boomsticks out" one more time, I would have lost my mind. And all of this is going on while Moxie horny yells into your ear as the rounds pass, so if you're into that, this might be your favorite part of the game. There isn't any big special final boss to each specific area either. Each one takes about an hour to clear, making this the longest DLC, and it really shows that while Borderlands combat is fun, it is not made to be done in a one-on-one arena for hours at a time with nothing going on. They weren't making Risk of Rain here, yet. The actual environments you fight in are also just slightly reworked locations we've already played in, which contributes to this idea that I got while playing the DLC that it's just kind of a way to get something out while making as little new content as possible. But things like these statue designs probably could have used another look from every angle. Or maybe that's the point, I don't know, this is Borderlands. Outside of that one little laugh, I did not enjoy myself at all here. The loot you get after each round ranges from bad to shit, and the final reward for beating everything is also pretty much nothing. It's actually the only time throughout my entire gameplay playthrough that I dreaded moving on and playing more of it. So compared to the awesome experience of Ned's Zombie Island, this is a straight up 2 out of 10, maybe a 1 out of 10 if it wasn't for the bank. Let's just move on and pretend this never happened. Thankfully, what's up next is the Secret Armory of General Knox, the content that most people know as the point where Borderlands 1 took a massive step forward. Knox himself is also a fan favorite character, and unlike Ned's Island, this promises massive loot upgrades. So how does it hold up now? It's good, mostly. We're teaming up with Athena, a former Lance assassin who doesn't like them anymore since they had committed the minor crime of making her murder her own sister. In exchange, we're offered all the guns in their vault, but first we gotta help Scooter get some upgraded wheels. That's done through a fetch quest that sees us exploring the new T-Bone Junction. This is the best designed hub town in the game, and it has a lot of personality with the way it's set up. I can't explain exactly why, but it makes perfect sense that someone like Scooter lives here. We do get attacked once, but that's really just to let us know that Atlas is targeting us for the story. Our new cars aren't really anything super fancy and do feel pretty much the same as the old one to control, but it does allow us to head into the Crimson Highway to meet up with Moxie, who is in fact still horny, though this time getting to speak with her outside of just announcing. The idea of a highway level and pretty much whole DLC is actually pretty fun. I think it's well designed and has good pacing between the driving and out of car combat zones. Plus we get to hear General Knox for the first time as we clear some roadblocks, who is just the most depressed big little man, and I love it. And after talking to Moxie, we find out that our new employer has been kidnapped. So we gotta hop right back into the car and do a silly little prison break. And this is the point where I noticed for the first time, but definitely not the last, that every location you go between is insanely far away from each other, which wouldn't be so bad if this DLC had a single fast travel. There is not a single place that you can travel to outside of T-Bone Junction, which is solely used to return to the main game. And yes, I get the thought behind it. They wanted this to be a car-focused DLC with our shiny new toys, and play on the highway level design. But man, they really needed to just accept that cars were never going to be the focus of the game, because when I didn't have to stop for a story mission, I don't think I took a single fight in my car. I just drove right on by the enemies. The on-foot encounters on the way to Athena are fine enough. The Lance have always been more enjoyable to fight than just straight up bandits, so it has that going for it from the start, and there isn't really anything else to say about it. At this point, the devs figured out how they want to design combat, and it isn't different functionally from the end of the game sections that we've already seen. Shank's prison, though, is a really solid hallway combat section, reminiscent of the Atlas base near the end with the vault. The enemies basically come at you in waves between dialogue sections, and the dialogue is what gives us Shank's personality, and his entire personality is a gay joke. Very groundbreaking. The Shank,
That's Mr. Shank.
Mr. Shank, fight is well designed. Basically just a close one-on-one where you have to time your jumps to avoid getting stabbed as you mag jump. It's not revolutionary by any means, but enjoyable and probably one of the better ones in the game. Killing him does make Moxie sad, even though she told us to do it, and now we can go get Athena from her cell. Which, in kind of a dick move, she uses the teleporter to go home and makes us drive all the way back. And now would have been a really great place to add in a fast travel gearbox, just saying. Because the multiple 1,000-meter drives are starting to bog down an otherwise really well-designed set of locations. This is even more true for the next set of quests, which really just boil down to drive 3,000 to 4,000 meters, do one fight or grab one item, drive another 3,000 to 4,000 meters. It just feels like padding the runtime, and the best part of this DLC was by far the prison break section where we didn't have to touch cars. So we're just gonna go ahead and skip to the actual armory because nothing else is really different here. The fight to enter said armory is some more classic top tier Borderlands 1 combat though. A mix of large open lanes, close quarters combat, and tight corners, all depending on how close you are to the entrance. And once you're in the base, it is ominously empty. Music plays as you slowly find your way to Nox. And when we do get there, he was about to, in monetization-friendly terms, unalive himself. I hate that we have to use that phrase now. But since we're here, he says that we might as well fight, since our Vault Hunter, in his words, will probably win anyway. The fight with Nox isn't bad. Probably the best one we're gonna see. I know I keep saying that, but the DLCs have gotten better and better. Besides Moxie, we were forgetting that happened. And Nox isn't the biggest threat, very slow moving with an obvious crit spot, but the medics and other devastators that keep showing up help increase the difficulty a little bit. I do wish we would have got a little bit more interaction with him as he dies, but beggars can't be choosers. Which brings us to what this expansion is really known for, and that is the vault we unlock after beating Nox. It's a cool mechanic where you get about 3 minutes to farm all of the chests inside while the bomb counts down. This is the best loot in the game, and it's not even close. Plus people have figured out how to farm it without the timer, so you can really just grab everything and sell it. Basically, this is the kind of loot that the endgame vault probably should have had. And then naturally, the DLC finishes with you traveling 5,000 meters to hand in a quest to Athena. It truly could not have ended in any other way. At least we got a mid-tier pistol out of it all. All that means we're nearing the end finally. We're on to our last DLC, Claptrap's new robot revolution. And I was honestly very excited about this one because I still think Little Clap is a funny guy. Right as we enter the new location, we're greeted in the same style of cutscene as Dr. Ned, where our bus driver is telling yet another story to his adopted daughter. It's about the same level of writing as the previous one, so it's solid. And we learn that Claptraps are tired of being slaves and are rising up against their oppressors, which includes us. Are we the bad guys? Don't think about that, because we finally get a proper intro cutscene for Tannis as she gives us the first main quest. And in this area, her personality really shines through a lot more than in the main game, which is likely just because she's actually able to consistently talk to us this time. And that takes us to the Hyperion Dump, where we get our first taste of Claptrap violence and super badasses, which are just badass but even more badass. The Hyperion goons are whatever, but I love the Claptrap designs. For the most of them, they just threw an army hat on and gave them an extra gun, which is so simple, but it fits perfectly what I would imagine the Claptraps would think for an uprising. We also get communist revolution type sayings modified for the Claptraps as we fight throughout the dump, which is a really funny addition to the normal dialogue. A small side effect of getting some parts for Tannis is murdering a bunch of soldiers, but the Hyperion higher-ups actually really like that, so the story has us being recruited by them to deal with the Claptrap uprising. Oh yeah, that new company Hyperion is the last seed we needed to set up for the sequel. Its representative, Blake, is perfectly insufferable, in a way that I think we have all had a boss that gives off Blake vibes at some point, if you know what I mean. Moving forward to turn on the power plant, we'll continue to introduce new enemies, which I'm not too thrilled about gameplay wise because they are just renamed bandits and soldiers, but conceptually the idea of Claptraps taking over human minds as revenge for being enslaved actually does work really well, so I'll forgive it on some levels because of that. The Claptrap caves are environmentally top tier. As you move deeper into the winding hallways, seeing the areas that vary between glowing green to red to almost entirely gray, it creates this contrast between locations and keeps you engaged visually. It even eventually transforms into a full-on facility, keeping it fresh after you fought through the caves for a while. The leader Claptrap informs us that he brought back a couple of old friends, which we quickly see means old bosses turned Claptrap. And the first up we'll end up engaging is General Nox from the last DLC, who just desperately wishes to have stayed dead. The fight is exactly the same, if not a little bit easier since the ads are Claptraps this time, so I won't get too much into it, but I still really enjoyed listening to Nox as we fought again, and this time Nox got a better death line. And it does come with some pretty solid loot. It's basically a Temu version of his armory. Past that fight, this DLC does hold the trend of really long backtracking to hand in quests, but distance-wise, it's not nearly as long as Nox's DLC, so more on par with something like Dr. Ned. Though after making the jog, we're informed of some copyright infringement being committed to make the Claptrap army, and Hyperion treats that about the same level as YouTube does when using a 5-second movie clip, sending in super soldiers to kill everyone involved. It's fair in my opinion. The factory is held in what seems to be the town the Claptraps live in. It has an interesting design and some solid level layouts for combat. Plus, the enemy variety is staying strong with them constantly introducing new types of Claptrap enemies. We even get to kill Dr. Ned again, who's just as much of a pushover as last time. Which leads us into their production factory, which is the best set piece in this DLC and top tier in regards to the entire game. Each small area has some quirk of a Claptrap taking over it, giving the perfect mix of goofy and productive. Plus, we get to fight just Claptraps here, which is when the missions are at their very best. All of that while the big evil Claptrap, or maybe not evil, I'm still not sure who's on the right side here, hilariously tries to convince you that beating all of his minions and destroying his stuff is just a part of his master plan. We just don't get it. Turns out though, while we were out, an assault was launched on our base town, so we have to clear them out before heading to destroy the hive mind. The device we need is hidden in some random warehouses. Nothing too notable about these locations. So far, the most standard of the DLC. What is notable though is that the boss of this area is Commandant Steel. So we finally get to fight this girl after an entire game and DLC season, which feels right as the last bit of content this game sends out. The fight itself is also pretty fun. She's a slippery motherfucker with a fast charging shield, so it can be pretty challenging. But really the main reason I like this fight is we finally get to fight her. There's no other reason really. Taking her down and getting the wired device means it's time to go get the big bad interplanetary ninja assassin Claptrap himself. That is the only time I'll be using his full name. That took way too many takes. He's hiding in a massive Claptrap base, decked out exactly to his liking. He has set up 3 different coliseums for other Claptraps to watch us fight 3 different bosses that he already brought back. The only difference is this time Ned is in his undead form, so it's the much better version of the fight. The others are also just okay. Still being in a Vault remake is pretty fun, but the luster is starting to wear off from seeing them again. But the idea of a gauntlet to reach the final boss of Borderlands 1 is cool, so again, I'll forgive the reuse to an extent. The final boss fight with Claptrap has a nice full circle moment where you're taken back to where the game started, which is kind of a cool way to finish this game's life cycle. Then Claptrap caps the bus driver, but I think he's alive in the next game, so I don't know what's up with that. This boss really does feel like the end of the game. Being the hardest fight by a country mile, our big bad Claptrap hops into a moving giant tank with turrets on each side, a massive laser with a shield, and a section to spawn kamikaze claps. In a lot of ways, this feels like a better version of the Destroyer fight mechanically. Once you're able to take out the turrets, it isn't as difficult, mostly just making sure that the spawn Claptraps don't reach you as you wait for your damage timings, but it's not a cakewalk to reach that point. Altogether, this works as an ending both mechanically and thematically. I'm a big fan. Our reward is also quite nice, it being a room full of really high tier weapon chests. I managed to upgrade every single gun in my main loadout here, which is something I didn't get to do throughout any of the other DLCs, which pretty much concludes our DLC season for Borderlands. Altogether, these were worthwhile additions, except you, and I had a great time going through them, except you. If I had to give it a ranking, I'd probably go Mad Moxie in F, maybe F- tier, Ned Zombie Island in B tier, then Nox in A, just behind Claptrap, which is also in a high A. I don't think any of them quite reach the level of S. The best part about playing through these expansions is just seeing the game slowly evolve into more of a Borderlands 2 type experience. Still though, we aren't quite done with the game, because like I said however many minutes ago, once you beat the game and every DLC, you have the option to do it again, but harder. Borderlands post-game is really hit or miss for people I've talked to about it. Either you really enjoy the idea of replaying the game but with everything turned up a notch, which does mechanically fit the genre that so heavily relies on grinding for better loot, or you hate that there aren't some good post-game raid bosses for you to do with your friends and get better loot that way. It really just depends what kind of player you are. For me, I think the Borderlands formula makes sense in the time it was released. They really weren't sure that players were going to attach themselves to a game enough for boss grinds and the like. We see that with things like there being no dedicated drop tables as well, and they probably saw the game only had 10 to 13 hours of content without any DLC or post-game. Then with less budget and probably low time, the best move was just to increase the game's challenge and have them play through the same story, as if they were doing another playthrough. I generally do prefer post-game to be more raid bosses and grind focused, but I can also enjoy the fact that I get to re-explore Pandora in a set manner instead of grinding out the same handful of bosses for crazy loot. Overall, the playthrough 2 is a fun time if you really love Borderlands. If you're just kinda meh about it, or you enjoy the game but not a crazy amount, it's probably not for you. And that covers my full retrospective of the original Borderlands. This is a game that I played endlessly as a kid, but I wanted to try and look back without any rose-tinted glasses and objectively see if the game held up. When you compare it to what came after, it does have some serious issues, but that's to be expected with the first attempt. The core of what we all love about the franchise is still here though. A ton of guns, silly characters, bullet sponge enemies, and personality that just seeps through everywhere in Pandora. Then the characters feel different enough that replaying the game with each of the 4 feels like a new experience. I'm not going to go through and give the game an out of 10 ranking or anything. I'll just say that if you enjoyed the later games and have never seen where it started, I would recommend giving it a chance. You have to go in with the expectation that it's not going to be the same level of quality that you know the series for, but it's still full of the same fun energy that you probably love if you sat through this entire video. Thanks for that, by the way. And if you can find a couple of friends to run through the game with you, it's basically the same amount of fun you'll have when you play Borderlands 2 or 3. So if anyone is still here, thank you again for sticking through this entire video, and consider subscribing if you want to see more like it. I have several other full game retrospectives in mind or already in progress, or just general gaming history videos, so you can expect more content in this format. Now, I've kept you here long enough. I'm Coach Ferret, and I hope to see you in the next one.